Hello, everyone, and welcome to this Data Week session. I hope you've all enjoyed every other session so far. And right, this session is called New Directions for Data Economy, Potential of Anti-Rival Digital Goods. And my name is Anna Björk, and I come from Demos Helsinki, and I work in the Atarko project with my lovely colleagues here, and you will hear about the project soon enough. So first, very briefly, some practicalities. We have the chat function as usual, where you can ask questions from us. And then also we will be using Screen IO for some additional questions where you can respond anonymously also and tell about your views on the topics that we will be dealing with today. There will be a Q&A for the speakers after the presentations have already all been wrapped up, so there will be time in the end for that. And we will also post the link to the Screen IO for you to the platform chat. There are no questions visible yet, so don't get confused. I will add there. And I will come back to the issue of Screen IO in a minute. And if we look at the agenda then for the day, so our aims for the day would be to, first of all, introduce the potential of anti-rival goods to data economy as an idea. Then also to explore how anti-rivalry challenges business models and how thinking through these ecosystems supports the development of data economy. And then to discuss the design of the ecosystems of data economy. And we're starting now. And then first we have altogether three main speakers today. First, my colleague Atte Ojanen from Demos Helsinki will frame the session for you with kind of new directions to data economy. Then Dr. Esko Hakanen from Aalto University will discuss about firms to ecosystems and how this thinking frames to anti-rival goods. And finally, Markku Nousiainen from Streamer will discuss more of the technical design perspective. And then we'll have the Q&A. And finally, we aim at closing the event around 5:30 Central European time. I'm still in the Finnish time, so sorry about that. Right. First, maybe briefly about the Screen IO before I let Atte open the session more officially, so to say. So the idea is to insert questions there for you to reply on, and those are open questions, so you can tell more about your views on specific topics. And then we'll come back to those questions very briefly in between the presentations, but then finally in the end also if necessary. But let's try to keep the final discussions for your main questions in the chat then. Right. Without further ado, I give the floor to Atte, please.
Thank you, Anna. Pleasure to be here and see everyone. So yeah, first as an introduction to kind of what are anti-rival goods, how they connect to data economy. We are here on the behalf of Atarko project, where we really try to drill down on kind of how digitalization has potential to catalyze value creation by resource sharing. So with increasingly seeing more information, delivering more value and giving potential to more resource sharing, but it still appears that our incentives are somewhat misaligned to make it really happen, and in a sense really deliver the social benefits that could enable. But most of the digitalization also gives rise to a new resource class in our thinking. So many of you might know rival goods. And even non-rival goods. So rival goods are, can be a thing of such as a cup of coffee, which tends to be excludable. So only I essentially benefit from using it. And then there's non-rival goods, which might be things like club goods, so visiting museum, which isn't really not taking anything away from anyone. But then in our thinking, there might also be anti-rival goods, which is a kind of a new third distinction. And anti-rival goods actually gain value from being used and being shared increasingly. So they do not lose value, they don't retain value, but they actually gain value from being used. And we think many of the digital goods, such as data, can actually be characterized as anti-rival. So you can think of network goods like video games, which benefit from having more players and more vibrant communities, or even the symbiotic goods like internet as a whole, which are completely kind of non-excludable. So as said, within that Autarka project, we suggest that many digital goods are anti-rival in their nature, and they gain value from being used. In other words, in more economic terms, their subtractability is negative. So they actually have large kind of positive externalities, which is somewhat unusual, something that our current economic incentives and institutions necessarily haven't grasped yet. So we think that therefore the economics is also fundamentally different from that of rival or even non-rival goods. We really have to kind of change our institutions when it comes to data economy and other digital platforms to really foster their better use. And this is especially pressing given that the global economy is increasingly centered on data, as we've discussed, but still many of the frameworks around data economy are still at least somewhat flawed, especially if you approach them from kind of an anti-rival perspective. So data economy is very much dominated by a small number of tech companies. Citizens and contributors aren't really able to take part of the profits and really take part in the value creation, and societies in general kind of lack the tools to redress the imbalances of the data economy as discussed. So we don't really know how to compensate for producing, analyzing, and sharing of data. So we tend to resort to these traditional understanding of goods, using currencies for the compensation. But it's not really clear how well this is working. So the challenge is that markets lead to failures with anti-rival resources. So most of these digital anti-rival goods, such as data, it's really quite challenging to exchange them in the markets because it's incredibly hard to kind of pinpoint a single value. The value is very much dependent on the stakeholder and what other resources they have at use. And this is obviously problematic by conventional economic structures because it is essentially based on exchange. If we don't have exchange, then there's no profit incentive. And to, in some sense, fix this, many of digital platforms have introduced artificial scarcity. So you can think of, say, paywalls on news sites, which, well, essentially artificially limit the spread of information, thereby also limiting its social benefits. And thereby we get reduced efficiency and societal loss in value because the beneficial value of information isn't spread as the kind of anti-rival value of nature of this goods would suggest. And we're still kind of lacking the kind of ways to organize around anti-rivalry. So there's things like trust and interpersonal relationships on a very small scale. Then there's open access publications and other things, and also open source. Those are things that are existing. But however, these alternative systems are rather fairly small scale. They're based on institutional power, or they're very context specific. So on the kind of wider economic scale, thinking about data economy, we're still kind of lacking the means to get there. And that's kind of what we're trying to do within the Autarka project. and really try to explore the abundance or the potential for positive change, the abundance of digital goods creates and those opportunities. And to leverage that the technology for social good, we need governance, we need new spaces for imagining and experimenting with alternative and new ways of organizing economic interaction and collaboration. And that's really kind of what we're after. So what we're trying to do is kind of, our vision is kind of creating this creating this new decentralized technology, which we call anti-rival tokens, by which we can then create scientifically funded proposals for new policies to enable more efficient and decentralized trading and ecosystems for anti-rival goods, and really thereby make use of the social benefits and values. And very briefly, here's just a couple of things that what this potential might be. So in terms of value creation, we've seen on the current kind of economic systems around digital economy and data economy are rather extractive. So the logic of extraction is very prevalent by kind of using the artificial scarcity of data and digital goods, creating those to leverage more power and profit. But what we would like to see is more regenerative and community-based value creation models and distribution mechanisms that really take into account the social and communal value of economic interaction and data sharing, and thereby unleash some of that creativity that perhaps the current value creation process don't really necessarily facilitate. And in terms of the collaboration, economic interaction, similar to the last point, kind of breaking away from the surveillance capitalism modes, would like to see more emancipatory capabilities that decentralized technology might give rise to. So new rules on decision-making, membership, more transparent and automated processes through contracts, input rewards and penalties for behavior. So really taking advantage of the how these DLT technologies and others can be really used to actively incentivize socially beneficial behavior and really try to better make that part of the system and its design in terms of the economics. And lastly, in terms of measuring prosperity, we think there's potential for going from growth-based measures around economic growth to more inclusive economic development. So central indicators of economic development would take into account the social and planetary well-being, and really measuring those network effects and benefits and their large positive externalities. And as a last point, there's obviously something's already emerging. There's the open source software movement, as we've discussed, very vibrant, and there's also community currencies, and then there's also kind of things on the kind of supply chain side and community platforms and other platform cooperatives and others, and things like Holochain and CommonStack and others, which are really trying to really make use of DLC or blockchain or other decentralized technologies for social goods and with social lens. And I believe our other panelists will then give you a bit of a more introduction to what in their mind some of these things might be. But that's it from me, and I hope we have a fruitful discussion.
Thank you, Atte. And yes, so as you can see in the platform chat. I've inserted the link to the screen IO there, where you can share your views about different things. And now there are the first two questions about concerning especially the anti-rival perspective. But we'll have I'll add the questions gradually, but they'll be available to you to respond to until the end of the session. So if you rather focus on what our speakers are saying, you can also come back to those questions afterwards. And so far, the opening questions are: can you think of good examples of anti-rival goods? And then also, what do you think about this anti-rival goods in general? How could they change our economies and societies? And there's a comment about anti-rival transactions and interactions have a stronger emphasis on relationships, and then also music as an example of an anti-rival good. Yeah, but moving on to our next speaker then, who's Dr. Esko Hakanen, and I'll let you introduce yourself and kind of fade into the background at this stage. And Esko, you'll be sharing your own screen, right? Yeah. Please, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Anna, and thank you, Atte, for the great introduction. And actually, I love what I'm already seeing there in the first answers on the screen IO. So actually, this is a brilliant segue to my talk as well about favoring the relationships more in the future. So hence the topic for today. So from firms to ecosystems, and especially how this kind of anti-rivalry could come into play in this type of setting. So hopefully I can, in this short time, make some kind of sense on where we are approaching these topics, why we think these are important, and so forth. So let's see. I'll do my best. So first of all, hello everyone, pleasure to meet you. So my name is Esko Hakanen. I'm a postdoctoral researcher, basically on management, but more specifically on business models, data-related services, platforms, and increasingly over the last few years on ecosystems. I also happen to be the project manager in our Atarka project, which is our joint vehicle for getting together all the panels here. And I work in Aalto University, Finland, hopefully familiar to many of you already in the past. And just to kind of start off, I want to kind of emphasize, so we're having this session on anti-rivalry. So why I'm talking about ecosystems. So first of all, this is of course something I tried as a researcher, I tried to bring a little bit of the background on what we are doing, what kind of changes we are encountering, what we witness, and what kind of changes we can see that happens in the society at large. So how basically companies are doing their business. And one major thing that you must have noticed over the last few years is that basically everyone is talking about this concept. So everyone is saying about something about ecosystems. And I would argue that in most cases, this is something that basically people are talking about. So we are somehow drawn into this natural analogy. So coming from biology, we're talking about ecosystems, how different organisms interact together, and basically how everyone wins. So we are talking about something which is a little bit mystical and somehow getting us all in the better positions. And that's of course appealing. But the problem is that when you're only taking this side of the biological metaphor, you're quite easily forgetting this side. This is also biology. This is an ecosystem. And I would argue that for this little guy here in the bottom of the screen, this is not a win-win situation. So we shouldn't overlook the whole background of the analogy that we are drawing from, what it actually means. And the second part why we talk about this transition from firms to ecosystems is quite naturally related to data. So slightly perhaps before outdating the ecosystem discussion, you must have heard this quote. It was all over the place. So data was the new oil. And I have been working really closely with, let's say, large industrial companies, doing research on them. And basically, this was really evident in that context. We were talking about, with these companies, they more or less perceived data as something that is really valuable, that is they're basically sitting on top of this imaginary oil well. And actually my response to this analogy and this metaphor was this. So there's nothing wrong with thinking that data is the new oil. That was Clive Humpy's original point. But in many cases, we got the scale wrong. So if you're just a single operator, let's say a single company, most likely you are not sitting on top of an oil well, but rather you are facing something like this. So imagine going through your day and getting this on your desktop. So most likely you're not kind of seeing riches in front of you, but rather a bit, let's say, a little nasty substance that you want just get rid of. And this is also true for the data. So both sides are true. You have to kind of consider this from the big picture and consider how then turn this into something valuable. And that is one answer to the question why we're kind of talking about ecosystems, why we are talking about this transition from firms to ecosystems, which is more or less prevalent in various contexts and industries. So from that point of view, I would like to slightly kind of give a background. So if you're talking about ecosystems, especially in this management research context, what is really new in this discussion? So how this is different from the long tradition we have in the management research that has been growing in the past, even let's say 50 years or so. So first of all, to start, something I kind of said already, but this is actually from a quote from one of the articles of Michael Jackvides, a really kind of leading scholar in the ecosystem field. And he is arguing that in a growing number of sectors, the firm or even the industry, it is not anymore a meaningful unit of strategic analysis. So we need to think bigger. We need to kind of consider something that goes beyond our immediate scope. And then, of course, what that something is. Well, we are used to refer that as an ecosystem, but we can also think a little bit differently. So if we look simply at the practice, so what the companies are themselves doing. So this is actually, this is Jussi Herlin from Kone. I was attending a presentation of him a few years back now. And basically, he was talking of the very same thing that management researchers talk about ecosystems. Here, he was just describing that how they actually need to move as a company from their comfort zone. So what is really familiar to them, having these supplier customer relationships and so forth in some kind of partnerships, co-creation, something that we do together with many others. So something a little bit more ambiguous in terms of dividing the labor, for instance. And the vision there is basically new growth and profit opportunities. So this is happening. It's evident both in the management, let's say research side, and then the practice. And there are a lot of more ways to kind of look into this. So for instance, this is something we once knew as product families, but now we tend to call these as ecosystems. And since we are looking at different things, we are facing more and more questions. So for instance, if we are talking about different ways of structuring the network value creation, what kind of structures we are facing? How, for instance, how centralized systems you can have? Or then in this example, should you prefer something that Airbnb is representing or Uber? And in which situations they are preferable? Then there's also very different ways to look at this. So we are using the ecosystem word really casually here. So for instance, Google's ad ecosystem, how that works, who are there in play. So this is more and more prevalent. So everything is starting to be an ecosystem. So it really begs us the question, what truly is an ecosystem? What is really essential for this thinking that we are talking about here? So one more thing to add here. So we are talking about ecosystems and referring to that's kind of natural analogy. So basically having some kind of symbiotic relationships, or then basically being a competition of the survival of the fittest. So basically in this context, it is also important to consider that many of these companies that themselves claim to be ecosystems are kind of facing these situations. So not everyone is happy to have these organizations leading to cooperation. Basically, everyone is not buying their story that this is a win-win situation. So from that point of view, what I strongly encourage you from the, let's say, research point of view is to continuously kind of be critical. So all of these are surely complex networks, that is for sure. But are these really ecosystems in the true meaning of the word that we are used to in this context? So from that point of view, it is really relevant to consider what the ecosystems then are. So how they are different from previous management insights or research knowledge that we have from this context. And one key aspect that is pretty much unanimous in the management field is that you are having some kind of new terms of how different parties engage with each other. So what that actually means. So basically, this is all about these type of questions. So we have a long tradition of research on organizational networks. Basically, what we can draw from there and what is then new in this ecosystem thinking. And just to answer those questions, you need to kind of consider these points. So how would you then define the two concepts and how they are different? So especially how you then differentiate between the two discussions. And this is relevant because from the practice point of view, so if you have different successions for different situations, you have to understand what are you really looking at in order to understand how should you move forward. So what kind of options are preferable in which kind of circumstances. And the reason I'm actually kind of talking about this thing today is it originates actually this day and meeting. So this is also my picture from AOM, so Academy of Management annual meeting. So basically the biggest management conference annually. And here actually I attended a session where if you have read any management ecosystem literature, you must have encountered these names. So basically that was really kind of, let's say, the superstars in the field. And I was really drawn to this question from the presentation of Kathy Eisentraut. So actually they're speaking right now. And she was really taking this, trying to differentiate between the network and ecosystem concept. And I'm also kind of building here a really short summary, so I'm not going into details, but as a really short summary, so I'm also building on from the work of Ron Abner here in the background and many others names that you can see on the board. But basically, as a key differentiators, and this is a simplification, so don't get too attached. But in any case, it's really making a difference. So are we in this kind of left-hand side column, which we used to call networks pretty happily, where we are somehow kind of picking our partners, who we work with, who we have long-term relationships, how we then kind of make an agreements on the rules, and how with whom we have really kind of clear rules on how we then kind of create value together and then share it, because we have actually, we can make a contract. And the key point in this setting is that actually you are doing the contract. So you are defining before you start some operation. So before something happens, you can pretty much know what is the outcome of this operation. And what I'm really want to emphasize here is that in this comparison, the right-hand side is different in many ways, but the key distinction actually for me is this the last row. So ecosystems, since these are dynamic, we are not really setting as strict rules on how the interaction happens. We cannot really know what is the outcome, who actually won in this situation until we wait out and see. So neither do we know actually if the little guy in my beginning slides, so if he or she was actually eaten or not. So if who won the battle and so forth, we just have to wait and see. And that is really a part of the ecosystem discussion. We mustn't forget about that. And sorry. And just to kind of simplify my key message here. So this is actually also one illustration from a research paper by Sipil and Gaver. And here it's important to remember that these aspects go back and forth. So basically, in this example, they're talking about how Apple provides office equipment, so laptops, mobile phones, and such to any company, people. And basically, in this example, they have formed an alliance to make those products better. So just to improve the cybersecurity of those Apple devices, they have formed an alliance. And there you have Cisco in the left-hand side. So you have Cisco providing the network hardware, AON providing risk assessment services, and then we have Alliance there to provide insurance. So if with all our work we fail and in providing your cyber secure solutions, we are there to ensure that this is our liability then. And this is very much a network. So this is the traditional way. So we make a contract that we are offering this to you as a customer. But the ecosystem perspective in this very same figure is much more ambiguous. So if I would be an employee in this company, I would use the device, but most likely I will use software, which is not part of this original agreement. So I have a large ecosystem of different kind of providers, different collaborators, which are still defining how much value I can derive out of these Apple products. So it's making much more complicated to analyze this situation. So who is actually making my life better? So who is really helping me to create value with these products? Even though there's this complicated network alliance in the background. So from that point of view, so I mentioned that these are new terms of engagement. So this is more or less an unknown territory. So a quote again from the same Michael Jacobitis, what he is then suggesting that instead of these single firms, we need to look broader. We need to consider who are collaborating with the companies and in especially the terms of engagement in these settings. Then we need to kind of direct our focus on how these kind of orchestrators or integrators or whoever who are leading this collaboration, how they then can influence. So what kind of power structures they could have, what kind of data is related to the setting, who own that, and then more importantly, so how let's say the leading organizations then interacts with different organizations. So how you interact with your complementers in this setting. So if you remember the Apple figure I just showed, basically who are there in the outskirts, who are then helping you in the right-hand side, and who are helping you to create value to your end customer. So from this point of view, I would like to kind of give an example of my own. And when I'm saying my own, it means that I've been using this in different presentations, but actually the credit, of course, is not mine. It is actually much down to the work done by Streamers /TX. So actually our partners in the Autarka project, something that they have done a few years ago before we started the project. But I still personally like this example really much, because we are a little bit struggling to find let's say, well-functioning examples of ecosystems in practice as we define them in the management literature. And I think this is a really nice example in many ways. So first of all, Tracy. So this is a really, let's say, from a different perspective. This relates to really small scale artisanal tuna fishing that happens in a specific part of the Philippines at the moment. And basically, this is a really far from, let's say, our traditional data economy thinking. So this is a really simple context where we are kind of analyzing and trying to kind of investigate what is happening. But in any case, in this example, these 4 companies have collaborated, and they have developed a solution called Tracy, which is basically used to trace and track fish catch data in this context. So basically, what kind of catches the fishers have got over their day. And what that means in practice, so basically this is, let's say, relatively simple mobile application, simple in principle, not in practice. So as a fisher, most of these fishers still have mobile phones, even though they might otherwise not seem so kind of data economy poster child. But in any case, they have a mobile phone, which they can then use to create verifiable catch documentation. So you have this application, and you are then basically inputting and logging your catch data into the system, and then utilizing that data as you are then selling the fish for these traders. And why I love this example is that even though this is coming from really simple, let's say, real life problem that we don't really know what fish they are getting, how much, for instance, we are fishing the tuna there in this setting, what kind of catches you have in average, and for instance, we don't really know what these people are doing for a living. So this is all off the record currently. But here we can actually, if we investigate the situation, we can identify a lot of different kind of activities that are interrelated, and then we can identify rewards which are indirect to, let's say, from a traditional sense. So you're not really selling and buying data, but rather you are kind of doing something that is worthwhile for everyone. So in this kind of setting, this is also a really kind of simple illustration. But in the left-hand side, you have the fisher folk who are then using the Tracy app to log their catches. You have there something that Streamer and TX are there to provide. So basically the application, and then something that is called here as data union. But we don't have to go to the details, but basically just kind of a compilation of data. And then, of course, since we have a compilation of my and all of you catch data, we can get that together and then find a new use case for that. So for instance, someone like WWF can then, thanks to our data inputs, know how much catch we have got a certain day. And what is really kind of interesting for me is actually what happens there in the top of this image. So basically, previously these workers have been a little bit under the radar. You don't really know who has been doing what and so forth. How long have you been fishing? What kind of catches do you have? Now we have a solution for that. So it's verifiable solution to kind of monitor what you are doing daily. And that provides a completely new opportunity for these people. So actually now you have a proof of work. So you have a work record. So you know, so others can know that as well. And that can be a basis to provide you a bank loan, for instance. So this is, let's say, the really interesting stuff for me. So I'm not really sure if I'm doing a real justice for this case. I'm a little bit trying to kind of hurry this through. But let's try to kind of recap this from with a slightly different perspective. So if we are just looking at this compilation of participants and why they are then coming or drawn to this system, I would argue that there is no single party who can then kind of make sure that people are drawn to this platform, but rather this is an ecosystem where all the participants have different reasons to join the system, and this is what is making it sustainable, or can make it sustainable, because you have reasons to keep coming back, and these are not drawn to and identified to a single party. So if we're just looking at these partners I mentioned, so in summarizing these again in a really short and simple way, so you can have someone such as the World Wildlife Foundation who has the challenge of kind of not having reliable catch data, and this is a very different problem and purpose for joining the system than, for instance, if you're a bank, you are of course happy to have new customers, and in this setting these have been really difficult loans to give, but now they actually have, let's say, a proof of work, something that they can rely on making their decisions. And for the fishers as well, I think this is also a really kind of interesting point of view. So in addition to kind of this mentioned opportunity to kind of get a new funding, get a loan, which you were not eligible beforehand, you're of course, as a fisher, you're interested in your livelihood now and in the future. So basically, how can we monitor the fish stock levels also in the future? So you're kind of in the same boat than the WWF, but you're still looking this from your very own personal interest point of view. And then it's also kind of, for me, interesting to have Streamer/PX and this Tracy application there, because there you're looking this completely differently. So Streamer is an open source data streaming platform or ecosystem, and it's really difficult to explain what Streamer actually does and why is it a relevant company. And I think this is a great example that if we have these kind of use cases, so it can be used to track and trace fish catch data to make more sustainable fishing possible. That is much more practical and easy to understand for let's say innocent bystander than many of the other kind of complex decentralized Web3 stories that we are used to hear. And what is really kind of from business model point of view really different here is that you cannot really define a business model in this example, except that you have these different activities, you have a complex activity system, and you have to have all of those in place in order to have a sustainable system. So if you take one partner away from here, it's not as good a system anymore. So from that point of view, my short summary of the key points that I want to make before and what I want to part you with. So in this thinking from firms to ecosystems, how we are kind of seeing a transition of the businesses as we have used to know them into some kind of a new way of thinking. Most of that value that you are creating there, it stems from a really complex interplay that happens between a firm or many firms and then the ecosystem. So it's making it much more complicated to consider who is actually the key partner in this role. Going back to that Apple ecosystem example, so even though you had the formal alliance with certain partners, it might well still be that if I'm choosing my next laptop for work, it might be down to not having the right applications I need interoperable with the Apple laptop instead of, let's say, something that runs on a different operating system. So it can be that simple. And there it's difficult to say that the alliance there that was in place has failed, but it's much more down to much more complex interactions that we can then manage traditionally. And and just to kind of connect back to the original part of the or title of the story. So in many cases, as I mentioned, so this is somehow linked, this kind of interaction, into some kind of anti-rival goods, because that only makes sense. So if you have something that is of little value, that is difficult to monetize, it really makes sense to bring others on board, to make something bigger and more valuable together based on what we already have. I think with those words, actually, I would be really happy to conclude. So thank you for your attention. Thanks again, Anna and others for having me here. And I'm really happy to pass the torch forward, and I will be eager to have any questions soon in the end.
Thanks very much, Esko, for this presentation and these very interesting openings towards more kind of ecosystem thinking. And there are now additional questions already in the Screen.io, where you can comment on the themes from Esko's presentation. And please feel free to do so also until the end of the whole session. Yeah. Okay, we will, I'm looking at the time, so we will move forward to Markus' presentations next, and I'll give the floor to you, and we'll come back to any questions you may have after Markus' talk.
Okay, thanks, Anna. I hope you can hear me all right.
Very
so
well.
I'll share my screen, and then let's start the presentation. It seems that I can't share my screen well, I need to quit Zoom and then return, so it's a little bit complicated.
That's
I'm
totally
sorry.
fine. I can also do it for you, Marco, if you share your presentation to me in the Zoom chat, for example.
Okay, yeah, all right. Yeah, sorry about this complication.
No problem whatsoever.
Yeah. So, file. So you should be able to see the presentation slides in the chat now.
Yes, just a second, and let's hope then that I can share my screen. So 1 second.
Okay. I have just updated the operating system in the computer, and now it's asking for different kinds of rights for different software. So this is the privacy problem now that we are having.
Okay, so can you see my screen now?
Yes, except
Excellent.
that it's a little bit, can you make it full screen? It's kind of cut in the
yeah, sorry,
part.
for some reason. Just a minute. I'll try again. Oh dear, sorry, one more time.
I can also.
Oh, yes.
Okay.
Now
That's
works.
fine, I think.
Perfect. Okay, so let's start. So yes, my presentation is to continue from where Esko left the topic. So Esko was talking about ecosystems and the difference between ecosystems and networks, and why ecosystems are a topical object of study at the moment. And my own background is in service design, and I'm going to talk about a topic which is around service ecosystem design. And I'm going to explain what is ecosystem design in a couple of moments. Can you go to next slide, please? So my name is Markku Nousiainen. It's really nice to see you. I hope to get a lot of questions from you, and I'd be really happy to answer you whatever you might be wondering about based on this presentation. My background is in service design. I've been doing different kinds of service and UX design for several decades, and now the last couple of years been focusing on only on Web3 ecosystems and different data economies, data monetization, and data sharing platforms. And now I'm working as a service designer in Ataka project, and I'm representing the Streamer DX team. Next slide, please. So let's talk a little bit about different ecosystems. What we have currently or traditionally are what I would call centralized platforms. So we use a lot of web services which are different kind of platforms. For example, YouTube or Uber are different platforms, and I would call them centralized in the sense that the value goes through the platform application, and then the different ecosystem members are dependent on that centralized platform. While if you look at the right side column, you can see another model which would be called decentralized ecosystem, but to be more exact, I would say that it's not completely decentralized. So all decentralized ecosystems are more or less to some degree also centralized. So we still have some platform for the management, for the access, for the front end and the user experience, but then the underlying structure doesn't completely depend on the centralized platform. And then if we look at the value streams in these two models, in the centralized model, the platform creates all value streams, while in the decentralized model, there is some direct exchange of value between the ecosystem members. In the centralized model, the identification happens through a central authority. You could, for example, have the bank credentials to sign into the platform and use that. So the bank as a third party provides the identification. While in the decentralized solution, there is some Web3 decentralized solution, for example, SSI, the self-sovereign identity. And then if we think about payments, so actually money transfer in the centralized solution, everything goes through the platform. It could be fiat currency, so regular euros or dollars or something else, or it could be crypto. While in the decentralized solution, it may flow directly between the members, and it's typically in crypto then. And then if we think about governance, in the platform, a centralized platform option, it's the platform company that is governing the structure, so they pretty much have the power there. While in the centralized solution, the power and the decision making is also to some extent decentralized, and it typically happens with some kind of governance tokens. So this is just a very brief summary about these two different models. So the left side model refers to Web 2 and the right side to Web 3. And of course, our focus right now is on Web 3, but we need to understand very much also how the traditional models work. So what is the Web 2 solution and how we want to deviate from that. Let's have a look at next slide, please. If we look at Web3 design, this is a traditional definition of the different pillars of the design. So we have the market design, we have mechanism design, and we have the token design. So when we talk about market design, we talk about the environment in which the participants can interact and transact with each other. So to create the conditions where the value exchange happens. I would call it pretty much the ecosystem also, but in traditional speak, it's called the market design. And then if we look at the central pillar, it's called mechanism design, and that refers to the rules that govern the ecosystem and the actions of the participants. So, for example, what kind of rules are created for exchange of value, exchange of, let's say, trade or behavior between the participants. And these rules can be either embedded in code. So, for example, in Web3, that would be smart contracts, or they can be different behavioral rules, like voting rules, for example. And then the third pillar is about token design. And this is purely technical or mostly technical aspect. So defining what type of tokens are used in the ecosystem, how is the token supply made, what is the token policy like, and so on. And basically the token design is very mathematical in a sense. So this is the traditional definition of how Web3 ecosystems are designed. But of course, this definition or structure is not very user-centered as such. So I would call it the traditional model of Web3 design. Can we have the next slide, please? Now, I would like to talk about user-centered Web3 design and user-centered Web3. So user-centered design is the main paradigm of Web2. So basically almost all successful platform services that we use have been designed with the users and the user needs and wants in mind. Then how it happens, it typically happens by involving the users in different stages of the design process, doing some user studies, doing some co-design activities with them, for example, and then testing the prototypes with users so that the developers can get early feedback about possible changes that need to be done. So the user-centered process is very much centered around user needs and marketing needs also. Next slide, please. And the difference between Web2 and Web3 systems have been already recognized in quite a many instances. This quote is from a paper published by Outlier Ventures, one consulting company that has done quite a many renowned Web3 token design projects. They say launching a token economy is fundamentally different from launching a venture in that an economy is a set of complex systems of governance, economics, and cryptography combined into a single distributed system. So it starts sounding like Web3 design is very complicated. Let's have a look in a few moments. Let's have a look at the different complicated aspects of this. But in any case, we are dealing with a set of different actors that have their own agendas and own value production, and that need to coordinate their actions and collaborate between themselves, and also create a governance to make decisions and to take the ecosystem further. So this is definitely a big challenge here. Next slide, please. Let's have a look at web design and the continuum of different generations and the history of web design. So we talk about web generations. Web 1 was the first generation, basically in the 1990s. It was about websites that have a centralized structure. So website runs on a server. It's centralized service in that sense. It's a kind of simple service in the sense that it provides information to the users. And the design approaches that we used in this stage was called human-computer interaction. Usability was a very often used word in that time. UX, which means user experience, and UX design was already part of the design toolkit in or a design approach in that time. Then what came sometime around 2000, in the first decade of 2000, around 2005 or so, we started getting a lot of different web platforms that provided centralized services. So this is called the Web 2. So they are basically platforms and social media. All social media platforms are Web 2 services. They are still centralized. They run based on a central company that provides the service. And the design approach that we have started using for Web 2 is basically service design. It's kind of curious that service design as a discipline has kind of become a mainstream activity or approach around the same time as Web 2 became very popular. So they seem to be very much linked to each other. And then what we have now starting is Web 3. Web 3 is about token ecosystems, peer-to-peer networks, DAOs. DAO stands for Decentralized Autonomous Organization, and so on. So they are basically decentralized services. And I'm arguing that the approach that we should use to tackle these is not exactly the same kind of service design anymore. I would call it service ecosystem design, or just ecosystem design in short. Let's have a look at the next slide. So how are Web3 service ecosystems different? Then a couple of aspects here. First of all, the decentralization. So all activities and value flows are not controlled and curated by the central platform. So the members of the ecosystem may exchange value between themselves. For example, there may be some micropayments from one member to another, and the payments don't necessarily go through a platform. Also, the governance is decentralized. So, the ecosystem members have voting rights, and they create value between themselves without a central platform in that case. Then complexity of actors. We have different actors in ecosystems, not just companies. In the first examples that Esko presented, the ecosystem members were mostly companies, but here we are talking about very sort of heterogeneous members. So there might be companies, individuals, associations, public actors, and so on. Then something which I would call organic development. So it's kind of typical talk in Web3 that people talk about launching a service or launching a token with the idea that this can be created just like a software launch, basically. But then if we talk about ecosystem, which consists of people and which are complicated, they cannot be exactly launched like a software, but they should be grown and they evolve gradually. So they are kind of organic in that sense. And then lastly, governance. With decentralization, you also need to have decentralized governance, which quite often means some token-based decision making. So for example, DAO, which is the Decentralized Autonomous Organization. Next slide, please. Okay, so many things are not so easy and rosy as you might think. To start with, there are some challenges in Web3 service ecosystem design. First of all, lack of agility. The result of Web3 development is in many cases predefined by a white paper and token. And this happens to be the case for quite many startups. They write a white paper, they define a token, and then they start implementing their roadmap. And this is the moment when usually you should start doing the service design, but actually you see that many things have been already written in the white paper and they should be following what has been written. So this is not exactly a very agile way of working. there are and there should be some ways to solve this problem, but clearly Web3 and agile development are not very synonymous to each other. Then we need iterations. As I said, the ecosystems need to be grown, so it's basically an iterative process. You do it little by little, but what we have in projects is typically the double diamond model. Double diamond is the standard model for many service design projects, for example, software development, and it's kind of straightforward in the sense that you define the design and then you implement it. However, this kind of straightforward process is not very fit for organic and iterative development of Web3 ecosystems and communities. Then about the service design tools, quite many standard service design tools are not very fit for Web3 purposes. So, for example, you have a business model canvas, which is a very typical model that we use, but the canvas is lacking many essential Web3 aspects, for example, the governance and the token design completely. Also, if you do something like journey maps, which are also a very typical tool in service design, you can catch the service experience for a certain ecosystem member in relation to the platform, which is a typical Web2 situation. But in the Web3, when the value flows are between the members directly, it's not very easy to use exactly this same tool to map the service experience. It should be at least adapted in some way. And then there are some aspects of ecosystems that are really hard to design with current approaches at all. So, for example, communities and DAOs, quite often in decentralized ecosystems, you talk about a community of people or early adopters. How to design a community? That's a very good question. We don't have very widely used and accepted tools for that kind of challenge. At least it requires a completely different approach. And then the tokens and the governance, which I already talked about. And then if you think about different aspects of the design that are needed, and if you want to apply a traditional user-centered approach, so starting from the user needs and user research, you easily run into a problem with some aspects that are not very easily deducted from the user needs. So, for example, the token design is basically a top-down activity. It's kind of mathematical design task, which is very hard to reduce to the user needs as such. So there's a kind of mismatch between user-centered design and then this kind of mathematical top-down approach for the token design. How to solve it? I don't think there are very good solutions to that. What we have been doing is basically a trial and error method there. So trying to find a token model that fits the ecosystem model and iterating it as many times as is needed so that you find a good fit with them. And then last challenge is that if you try to simply tokenize an ecosystem with rival tokens, so basically just bringing an exchangeable token to the ecosystem, you might actually destroy something which is naturally happening there without any token incentive. So you might destroy what you want to develop. Many things happen because people because of the social structure that people have, because of the natural incentives that they have, and if you try to incentivize it more, you might actually just destroy that natural incentive. Next slide, please. Okay, let's have a look at one approach how to tackle this ecosystem design challenge. What we are using in Atarka and have been starting to use also in commercial consultation projects up to that is called the Ecosystem Design Toolkit. So basically, this is a toolkit for co-creation with different partners of the design team and possibly with the ecosystem members. And this is specifically tailored for decentralized ecosystems. And we have been using another toolkit, which is called the Platform Design Toolkit, as a sort of background and the basis of this. It's an open source toolkit that anyone can download and start using with the instructions, except that the Platform Design Toolkit is mainly used for or intended for centralized platforms. And what we have been now doing is converting it into decentralized use as part of Atarka project. In this toolkit, we have very much emphasis on ecosystem mapping and ecosystem member profiling, the modeling of decentralized value flows, and the separation of rival and non-rival or anti-rival value flows. So trying to bring the special characteristics of Web3 here. Next slide, please. So, so this is an example of one of the pilot projects in Atarka, the Barcelona shop owners case. Working with the toolkit and some examples of the work that we did last autumn based on the toolkit. So, for example, here you can see the ecosystem map, which features the different ecosystem members, their roles and the identification of key stakeholders or ecosystem members in the ecosystem. And as you can see, that the ecosystem members are quite different here. So you have small businesses like the shops, you have public actors like the city council, then you have a platform application that we are going to provide. You have different kinds of consumers, local people, visitors, tourists. You have also some competitors, the supermarkets that are competing against the local shops, and an association, which is the neighborhood association, which is also involved. So all these actors are co-creating value here as we want to get it organized. Next slide, please. So the case is about so-called green shops in Barcelona. So they are a network of local small shops that sell agricultural products and other products from the neighborhood or in the Barcelona region, and with the intention of reducing packaging waste and CO2 emissions. And then also with the aim, as part of the Atarka project, we are aiming to keep the local shops alive and also that way keep the neighborhood active and keep up the social fabric that is between the neighborhood represents. So basically the people living there. So the goal is to foster local and responsible consumption and keep the local shops and the whole neighborhood alive. Next slide, please. Here, this is an example from the ecosystem design process. We are mapping the value streams between ecosystem members and trying to identify the self-reinforcing loops and ecosystem bottlenecks over there. So basically, when we identify value streams, then we would like to see value streams that self-reinforce themselves. And especially if it's a self-reinforcing non-rival or anti-rival value stream, then there is a lot of potential for anti-rivalry to be developed and emphasized. This is called a motivation matrix. So basically how to read this matrix, each actor which is featured on the column, on the left side column, interacts with each other actor which is on the top right, on the top row, and in the intersection of these two actors, you can see the value which is transferred from the left side to the top actor. And this way we can basically map all the value flowing directly between the ecosystem members and taking into account all the different members in this modeling. Next slide, please. So this is how it looks in practice. We've been working on Zoom. They have been all virtual workshops online using the ecosystem modeling tools on Miro, which is a collaboration platform. And actually, it has been very easy to work on this kind of platform. This could be, of course, also done in real-life settings with traditional workshopping tools. But because of COVID restrictions, we have been mostly working online. Next slide, please. And this is what the results look like. So basically, this diagram is what is called an activities map, and we have the rival value flows in red and non-rival or anti-rival ones in green between the different actors. And basically, this diagram has been drawn completely based on the motivation matrix, which was shown in the previous slide. So this is a visual representation of the value flows, and it can be used for analyzing, especially the anti-rival potential in this case. Next slide, please. Then I will just briefly mention some other alternative approaches to ecosystem design. Ecosystems can be also simulated in different ways, and simulations can be good approaches in the sense that ecosystems are very complicated and even chaotic systems, and instead of trying to model it completely, you might just want to try it out in practice as a simulation. And there are two very different approaches. One is the board game simulation, where you could use some existing board game, for example, Monopoly, to change and then change the rules and make it an ecosystem simulation. And this has been already tried in different contexts. It's not very easy and not very quick way to approach this, but it can be used to understand the mechanics of the ecosystem and also to empathize with different members. So if you play a game where you play the role of a certain ecosystem member, then you probably start understanding the viewpoints and the needs of that particular member. So empathy is one result that can be achieved with board games. Then another approach is computer simulations, and here we can divide them into two categories. So we have deterministic system models, which are called the system dynamics models. So deterministic model means that there are no uncertainties. So basically, you have a model of the value flows, and that is a definitive model of how it works. Then you have then there is another option, which are the stochastic models, and the stochastic models contain uncertainties. So basically, you have a probability of a certain thing to happen in the ecosystem, and because it's a very complex ecosystem, and the results depend on this stochastic aspect, then you need to run the simulation many times to get the average result and see what is the typical outcome of the interaction. But I'm not going to these simulation approaches anymore than this. Next slide, please. So the work is clearly unfinished. It's very much in progress still, and these are just some of the questions that we are still tackling at the moment. So we are now establishing a way to work with the ecosystem design toolkit and other tools like that to carry out a typical Web3 ecosystem design process. But as we can see, the process is not very easy and not very simple. So the question is how to simplify and economize the design process for practical reasons, to provide value to a customer who wants a certain result in a certain time frame and with certain resources. And just saying that this is very organic and iterative is not clearly not the right answer. In that context, we need to make some compromises between the iterative and organic nature of this activity and then the goal-oriented aspect also. Then how to add prototyping and iteration. So basically, as I said, quite often the process is defined by some certain parameters that have been defined. For example, there's a token that has been already defined, and maybe some funding for a startup has been obtained with the token, and the token, if the token has been defined, then that limits clearly the room of new approaches to ecosystem design. So how to make it more agile, more geared toward prototyping and more iterative without making it a very lengthy and a difficult process. Then how to find a match between ecosystem and token design. As I said, we have the bottom-up approach, which is basically the user-centered process, and then we have the top-down approach, which is related to the token design. So instead of trial and error, what would be a better methodology for this? And then I already talked about the governance, the communities, and DAOs. So basically, quite often we have some kind of community or a decentralized organization related to a Web3 concept, and designing this kind of communities of people is a completely new type of task for service design. How to grow it, how to invite the early adopters, how to incentivize them to stay active, and how to make it grow over time, and how to keep the people happy as community members. This is a challenge that requires new approaches. And then the user-centered or the participatory nature of the whole process. So how to involve community members in a way which is truly participatory. Quite often when we design Web3 concepts, we talk about something new that doesn't exist yet. We don't know where the people are. It's really hard to get in touch with them. It's quite difficult to, in some cases, to explain what the concept is about and so on. So these kind of participatory processes are not as easy as in typical Web2 service design processes. But I would say that probably in the next couple of years that we will have some more answers to these questions, and we will be taking this further. So what we have been seeing is just the beginning in Web3 ecosystem design. Okay, I would like to finish my presentation here and would be very happy to answer any question that you might have.
Thanks so much, Markku, and also thanks once more to Esko and Atte as well. Right, so it's time to look at any questions you may have. There's some discussion already in the screen IO also about the questions that were added there before, and now you can also see the final one, which is more about the Web3, and we would like to hear your views on that as well. And you're free to use that, or you can still add your questions to the chat for the speakers. And while I'm getting myself back to the session, I believe there was one question at least in the chat. Atte, would you like to read that out loud while I get my technicalities together?
Sure, yeah, at least Yuri Demchenko was asking about a question about ecosystem as a complex to keep sustainability or complex factors and process to support the whole data life cycle. So yeah, I think this is about kind of sustainability of as a continuity of the ecosystem and how that feeds to the kind of later parts of the life cycle, whether that's related to data and so forth. But yeah, I guess Esko might have some thoughts on that.
Yes, thanks, Atte, and thank you, Yuri. So yeah, if I read the question correctly, and I think this relates definitely to the way I emphasize the complexity in the ecosystems and why that is. Not sure if vital is the right word, but why it's quite easy to, although it's unavoidable perhaps in ecosystems, the complexity. And it's more or less, from my point of view, comes from the fact that we have used to, well, conducting businesses, but also other kinds of transactions. So in our everyday life, we go to a supermarket and buy stuff from that vendor using money, and that's simple. So we know the rules of the game and so forth. It would be much more complex and difficult to know what would happen if we would have the same supermarket and no cashier at the end. So will there be apples for me next week? I don't know. Depends on whether someone else will want to give them there and so forth. So it's all about that kind of, let's say, the complexity of the different parties. But I think Markus, actually, the motivation matrix, that is a great tool and illustration that once we identify that there are different partners in play, they have different rules, different reasons to join in this kind of interaction, the big picture that we're trying to build here. That is really what supports the kind of the long-term survival of this community, that we have, all of us have different reasons to come together. And it's very different from let's say this traditional thinking that we see in many businesses.
Yeah, I would just like to add, so based on the motivation matrix, we can understand the value proposition of each of the ecosystem members, and we can see if there is enough value that the member is getting. If there is not enough value for some member, then it might be a point where we need to create some new incentivization, and in Web3 it typically happens with some kind of tokens. But those ecosystem members that are happy, that get the value naturally from other members, then we don't want to change, we don't want to correct something that is not broken. So keep it like that, and then only try to identify those spots where some intervention is needed in the form of tokenization. I'm not sure if this is correctly answering the question.
Well, I would like to, so thanks, Marco, really good addition to what I said. So this is definitely what we try to do in our current project and in overall when investigating ecosystems and trying to make them work. It's not about kind of making the obvious choices, but rather trying to find what is missing from there and how to support that what is missing. And that is also the kind of, I think from the complexity point of view, that is what also adding to it. So understanding that what is currently happening and should we bring something new to the table to make this perhaps more sustainable or kind of making more balanced in the way it operates.
Thank you both. Yeah,
I think in general about the sustainability of ecosystems, it's been said, it has been at least claimed that decentralized ecosystems, even though they are kind of harder to establish, they can be more sustainable in the long run. If they are, let's say, they are kind of more fair to each member, they have grown organically so that each member has found its own place and its own value proposition, and it has an established position as an ecosystem member, instead of a platform that might have been raised very quickly and launched all of a sudden, and with a value proposition that has been designed or created by someone else. So the centralized platforms or it can be argued, at least I'm not 100%, this probably should be researched, but centralized platforms can be more artificial and less sustainable in the long run than decentralized ecosystems, in the sense that they in the platforms, the power and the position of each member is kind of exerted from above. So there is a power from above that defines the position that each member has. And of course, we have seen some struggle in this. For example, in the case of Uber, we have seen how the Uber drivers start striking in different countries. They are not happy with their conditions and so on. And this is an example of power that is not within their reach. It comes from the platform that has the rules and has the say in the interaction. So it creates easily an unsustainable and unstable situation for the ecosystem members. But I think there can be different arguments related to this, and very little proven knowledge so far.
Thanks. Maybe at this point I'll raise one point there from the Screen.io discussion, that there's related to the question we had about can you identify indirect benefits among your organization or other parties that can be attained by more open collaboration. There's a point here made that can networks be anti-rival or only ecosystems? Would you like to respond to that?
Was this directed to me or who? But I can start at least. So, but yeah, thanks again. A really good question, and this is I think well, Atte's presentation was more of this anti-rivalry, but I think one thing that we didn't really kind of discuss there, and this is, let's say, more let's say a thought in the making. But at least one aspect that relates here is that the anti-rivalry could be, there are also papers on this view, that the anti-rivalry would be a more or less a systemic property. So something that relates to the infrastructure that we are using, like how the system, how we produce different things relates to the outcome that we are achieving. And then in turn, this kind of rivalry / non-rivalry would be more or less about the particular item or the goods that we are dealing with. And from that point of view, I would say that's, well, many networks. So if we consider an internet to be a network, then the answer would be yes, definitely. The internet as a network is an anti-rival structure that facilitates loads of different use cases, which are actually making this internet network more valuable in the long run. So the very first initiation of an internet with only few consoles and so forth was not as nearly as valuable as what we have here, also facilitating this session.
Yeah, I would say that a lot of what is called anti-rivalry comes from network effects, and even that term refers to networks. So just growing the network size in many cases brings some anti-rival benefits, as exactly has happened with internet since the beginning of it. But yes, well, I would argue that probably the biggest anti-rival potential is in ecosystems. At least it's more systemic and it can be developed more easily. But this is definitely a matter of argumentation.
Thank you. I'll now take a look at the chat here and see if there's still if there are still any questions for you. No, and yes, we have some points in the screen IO which we can then come back to after the sessions also internally and learn from then. Okay. I think we're coming down to the kind of closing remarks of the session, unless there's someone who absolutely wants to make the final point, then I would be wrapping up our talks from the day. Thank you everyone for joining, and once more warm thanks to Atte, Esko and Markku for your presentations. And thanks for the comments in the screen IO as well as in the chat. I wish everyone a very happy Data Week continuation, and hope to see you soon on different occasions and also on live events. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Anna.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Anna and everyone.